This is Reset. I'm Sasha Ann Simons. You don't have to be a survivor of gun violence to feel the impact caused by it. The trauma can affect family, friends, and even community members. One hospital-based program active in Chicago is lending a hand. Healing Hurt People. It's a hospital-based program that works to connect survivors and their families to resources that can help with everything from jobs to therapy. Now, as we continue our conversation here on Reset around how Chicago's tackling gun violence, we're joined now in studio by Ted Corbin. He's a professor and the chairperson for the Department of Emergency Medicine at Rush University Medical Center. Welcome, Dr. Corbin.
Thank you, Sasha.
Also here with us is John Rich, who's the director of the Rush BMO Institute for Health Equity. Welcome to the show, Dr. Rich.
Pleasure to be here.
So, Dr. Corbin, or Ted, as you said I could call you, I want you to tell us more about how Healing Hurt People works.
Sure. Healing Hurt People is a hospital-based violence intervention program that identifies people who've been exposed to, survivors of, and seen any type of violent injury, gunshot wounds, knife stab wounds, assaults. And a team of providers, social workers, community health workers, psychologists work with that person and their families and friends to connect them with resources while also providing them some behavioral health services, recognizing that from our work and from the studies that we've seen, trauma is really at the core of a lot of the cycle of violence.
Mm-hmm. As we talk about what you've seen, I know that Healing Hurt People was something that you two actually conceptualized together in Philadelphia,
Yes.
right? So what were you seeing? What initially made you realize something's wrong?
Sadly, it was a person. It was a person who had been shot one time, and when you don't hit a major artery, a bone, or a major organ, and you're stable, and medicine is such that we're really good at taking care of people, patching up people, and we discharge them without talking about or addressing any of the other things that come along with being shot, stabbed, or assaulted.
Mm-hmm.
And saw that person one time, and then sadly 2 months later saw that person again, and they were dead. And so realizing that this is a preventable issue and trying to figure out and think through what are some of the evidence-based strategies that we could employ or implement to address the issue.
Yeah.
Recognizing that there's a spectrum where folks can intervene, but what can we do as healthcare providers to help people heal from the trauma that they've experienced?
John, what can you add about that experience in Philadelphia?
Well, one of the things that we know is that in the hospital, we are good at addressing the physical wounds, but we know that more from science than we've ever known before, that trauma not only feeds the cycle of violence, but it is an underlying cause of many other forms of disease. So as a primary care doctor working in a inner city hospital, I saw lots of young people, not at the moment they had been injured, but maybe weeks later when they would come in for another medical problem or follow-up. And as I talked with them, it was clear that they were experiencing all of the manifestations of trauma. Mm-hmm. That is, they were jumpy, they were having nightmares, flashbacks. They lost the ability to feel certain emotions, which is very much described as a consequence. But because they didn't know what was happening to them, they would say to me, "I think I'm going crazy." And when you feel that hyped up, you can sometimes interpret very benign things as dangerous. That is, somebody looks at you, you may experience that as like, oh, my life is being threatened. And you may take action. You may get a weapon because you're feeling all of these things. So there's a tendency that we have to avoid. That is, we don't want to blame individuals for what happens to them. That just makes the trauma worse.
Right.
But when we in healthcare can express caring and empathy and then educate people about what may happen to them and then provide support, we have a possibility of interrupting that cycle. Mm-hmm. And the damage that Ted was talking about.
Yeah. And Ted, to that end, I mean, you spoke with people in the community and other emergency care providers, right? What are you hearing from them, from community members, about what they needed? to help with the trauma? And what are the providers saying too?
Sure. This was early on when we were conceptualizing the work that could or possibly take place out of a level 1 trauma center back in Philadelphia. And we had a focus group with some young people who had been exposed to, witnesses of, and survivors of violence. And something that they said they wanted to feel cared for. They want to get help getting back on their feet. Some of the basic things that you would think come with being cared for in a hospital, but not necessarily at that particular inciting injury.
And to be clear, this is them expressing what they need once they leave the hospital. Here's how you can still help me.
Yes, once they're in the hospital, once they leave the hospital, but also in the hospital as well. Because again, some injuries are such that they are treated and discharged immediately when they're seen in the emergency department. Some are more severe, such that they're admitted. And when they're admitted, there is an opportunity for some additional services to be provided. But again, not necessarily with the focus that we were trying to get at, and that was a focus on trauma. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, having a focus group with some emergency departments, with emergency providers in Philadelphia, recognizing that the department is a dynamic space. We have so many things that we're trying to attend to, different type of illnesses. And what they came up with, interestingly, they said an easy button. And it wasn't that they were trying to displace any of the responsibility, but bringing in a team member or someone that we can trust who will be in addition to the team to help address this issue of trauma and violence.
I see. John, what difference does having a hospital-based program like this one make on people? Like, have you seen what happens when the opposite of what we're discussing occurs, when those connections aren't made right there and then while they're still in the hospital to resources?
Absolutely. Again, the experience of injury is so disruptive that for some young people, that means they're no longer able to continue in school. For other young people, that means they're left in a very vulnerable state. And so having someone put their arms around you while also giving you the information that you need can really help settle you. And one of the pieces that Ted was referring to is that we as physicians, nurses, we have some expertise, but what we really need on our team are young people with the lived experience themselves. Mm-hmm. So these young people, when they are able to settle out, heal from their trauma, they're our best partners. We've hired young people who've come through Healing Hurt People to be members of the team. And they've been able to attest to what they experienced before they got support and what they've experienced afterwards. So this is a team effort. It really needs connections to community. But our greatest strength is these young people themselves. There's tremendous capacity that we often overlook in young people who have been victims.
Yeah.
Sometimes not really understanding their stories and what is driving them forward and what their aspirations for the future are.
Right. Well, to that end, you, John, you've emphasized how trauma drives this cycle of violence. Now, in 2021, our WBEZ colleague, Patrick Smith, actually sat down with several gun violence survivors around the city, and it was part of a series that was called Those Who Did Not Die. Now, he spoke with then 19-year-old Aisha Lowe. She and her friend, they were walking through a field near her West Garfield Park home in 2020, and they were caught in the middle of a shootout by two groups across the park. She blamed herself for getting shot, and she may have survived, but her relationship with her friend did not. Let's listen.
She used me as her shield. She put me in front of her. I'm like, what you grab me for? I'm like, I'm not nobody's shield. We don't talk no more. We don't socialize. Well, before, I used to be outside on the porch, kicking and talking, chilling. But I don't go outside no more since I got shot. I don't go outside. I stay in the house.
Now, we also spoke with Lakaya Knight yesterday. This was part of a panel discussion that we had about solutions to gun violence. And we were talking to her about her father. She lost her father in a police shooting.
Like, my family didn't even want to bring him up because they didn't want it to be like he died in vain. It separated. My granddad doesn't talk to us after my father passed away. He just, kind of moved on. Like, gun violence really separates a lot. It breaks a lot of foundation, but it just hurts.
The city settled an excessive force lawsuit after her father's death for $100,000. But I noticed you both nodding during that tape. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? Those stories.
Sadly, it does.
Yeah. I mean, how else have you seen community trauma from gun violence manifest?
Yeah, that's a challenging question, and it's also, I have to say that it's not just the manifestation of the community itself as much as it is the structural pieces that are in place that continue to be oppressive, and not recognizing how generations of oppression and generations of structural racism have taken shape in our communities. But I also want to flip back to the amazing resilience in our communities. You heard John mention that the young people who have had the opportunity to get resources after they may have interacted with a program such as Healing Hurt People, that it also gives them a mission to help others. And that's the piece that we also like to raise up and acknowledge in terms of the strength of the community, because the community in of itself has tremendous healing power as well, with some of the resources and the services that are generational, practices that have taken place that go that don't necessarily go acknowledged. And so where there is strife and stress and oppression in our communities, there is tremendous there's a wealth of resilience and hope and desire to do different.
So the goal is for a program like yours to be the norm, right? That when people come into the hospital after getting shot, that they're connected to resources that can further support their healing. Where are we seeing this happen in Chicago right now, John?
You're absolutely right. This is about a new standard of care that says a health system can't do everything, but there are some things we really can do. So we're seeing this at a number of hospitals in Chicago. Stroger, for example, has a program that's Healing Hurt People. The University of Chicago Trauma Center, as another example, has a violence recovery program. And they share the idea that we need social workers, community health workers. We need to make sure that we address trauma using really state-of-the-art interventions. So there are a whole range of different counseling approaches that can ease your trauma. But to Ted's point, we also know that there are lots of other things that help with healing. So if you're part of a faith community, that community can wrap around you. The folks at Healing Hurt People in Chicago at Stroger have a glass blowing program that young people participate in, because that engagement with your hands is also something, making something. And so we recognize that the support that we can provide in the hospital is the first step. It's the moment of injury. We cannot squander that.
Right.
But we make connections back to our partners in community who can help these young people get back to where they need to be. And the first young lady, it's heartbreaking to hear the first young lady, because if your only opportunity, if your only option is staying in the house, what does that cut you off from?
She was so young at the time when this
Exactly.
happened. We're almost out of time, but I do want to throw in, I mean, this is a conversation we have pretty often on Reset. And when we talk about people and their health journeys, a lot of times we get into conversations about folks advocating for themselves. Many times, like, their pain or their concerns, they're not heard and they're not taken seriously, especially people of color. So briefly, but before we go, Ted, what do you think is the role of healthcare providers and staff to just ensure that a patient's health inside and outside the hospital is taken seriously?
Yeah, this is where you heard John mention the standard of care. not just the standard in delivery of care, but the education of healthcare and medicine is really part of how we encourage our providers, our team members to recognize these issues so that they can be paid attention to, so that our patients can heal, grow, and thrive.
Right.
It's really about that. And so trauma-informed practice has been embedded into many of the curricula of medical schools. I can say Rush has adopted such, and our medical students, our providers, as well as our nurses are also being educated that in that way through actually Healing Hurt People at Rush or the trauma recovery program.
Yeah. We'll leave it there for now. Dr. Ted Corbin's professor and chairperson for the Department of Emergency Medicine at Rush University Medical Center. And Dr. John Rich is the director of the Rush BMO Institute for Health Equity. Thank you both so much.